In the last few years, the US has been quite focused on Indo-Pacific area. It was earlier called Pacific Command, now it's Indo-Pacific Command. There are a lot of changes there. Why do you think the US is so much focused there?
Well, the answer is obviously the China factor. China has been very aggressive, trying to enforce its own sets of rules, um, quite dismissive of international laws and international norms, especially pertaining to navigation in the South China Seas, which has really troubled many countries, which is one of the reasons why in a decade or so, you've seen the solidification of a four-nation alliance, alliance in a very loose sense, called the Quad, comprising of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. And the third Quad meeting is supposed to be taking place in Australia on May 24th. And it's the third in-person leaders meeting. They have met many times virtually and other occasions at multilateral forums. But China is the driving force for much of the problems, much of the challenges of the Indo-Pacific.
Why China is such a big challenge to the rest of the world?
Because the leadership in Beijing believes that the rules of the game can be drawn up and enforced in a China perspective. Now, whether you look at the Spratlys Island dispute that involves some 6 or 7 countries in Southeast Asia, including China, Taiwan is also involved. Vietnam is, Philippines is, Brunei is, Malaysia is, every one of these countries, but still China claims unilaterally, and it believes that it can establish control over the South China Seas by the use of military force, which is certainly going to be quite destabilizing, because South China Seas is an important waterway in which the critical oil needs of many countries, including India and Japan, flows through, passes through. So, we are looking at a very important part of the world. For example, you look at Taiwan and see what China is doing in the Taiwan Straits. Somehow you get the impression that China believes that it can take over Taiwan in a militarily, and that is going to be a very difficult proposition, given the fact that the United States is very deeply involved in the security of Taiwan. And then it would draw in other countries in the region, and it puts additional pressure on countries like India. On the one hand, India has been very careful not to get drawn into any kind of a military alliance of sorts that single out China. But on the other hand, India also is quite aware of what China is trying to do in the Indo-Pacific and along the line of actual control, in demarcating India and China. So almost every one of the countries that I mentioned have got their hands full, vis-a-vis China, but for different reasons.
The way the things are moving in the Indo-Pacific area, is it leading towards some kind of confrontation or?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Because any conflagration, any confrontation will be disastrous. Because you are talking about nuclear states. You're talking about the United States, you're talking about China, and you're talking about India. Um, uh, and then you're talking about non-nuclear states, which have all the wherewithal of turning this conflict, if it happens, into something deadlier than what anybody would envision. I hope it doesn't.
Where is India placed in the entire thing?
We have to play. We know the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. Um, we know what is in store, but we will never be drawn into any military alliance. Indian foreign policy will be governed by Indian national interests, keeping in mind the strategic imperatives of the Indo-Pacific. That's the reason we try to move closer to Australia, to Japan, and to the United States bilaterally, hoping that this bilateral thing will translate into a more meaningful posturing, not necessarily military containment of China.
Uh, is there any coordination between India, US, and the Quad that has been formed right now? Uh, what's the perspective of the Quad being led by the US?
It's not a led by, I don't think anybody has got leadership. Each one of these four countries are a leader of their own right. And you have to understand that the US is a major player in the Indo-Pacific. China is a very major player in the Indo-Pacific. And we all forget that Russia is also a very major player in the Indo-Pacific. Russia is as much an Asian power as it is a European power. Some people want to deny that. You're just denying that to your own detriment. So you have to factor in the Russian angle also. It's not as if Putin started the Ukraine aggression just to flag Russia as a superpower wanting to get back into the scheme of things. It is not because Putin wanted Russia to be once again the monster that kept the whole world awake at night. No. Basically, Putin wants to make sure that Russian interests are not ignored when others are drawing up their calculations. That's why we had this catastrophe, Putin's catastrophe in the Ukraine. But also because the West and the NATO refused to see what Putin has been trying to tell them for the last 20 years.
What is in the US? What is US objective or President Biden's objective in creating and strengthening Quad?
I think everybody has got China in mind, but for different reasons. But you see, it's better that you deal with China, bring them into a web of understanding, so that it will be very difficult for them to break out of it. You see, that is the containment, so-called containment policy of George Kennedy that was practiced, that was put on the table by people like Henry Kissinger. But unfortunately, this containment turned into military connotation, which was not at all the original intent of containment of the Soviet Union at that time. The idea was to draw in the Soviets into a web of agreements so that it will be difficult for them to break out. But unfortunately, it took the military route. And that's the same thing we are seeing as far as people wanting to contain China militarily. You give submarines to countries in the Indo-Pacific. That's not. You think the Chinese are afraid of a few submarines getting into Australia or getting into Japan? They're not. They're least bit worried about it. They already have 2 aircraft carriers, and they're building on the third. So it's an economic powerhouse, and we have to start dealing with the Chinese based on that. Now that doesn't mean that the world can sit back and let President Xi Jinping get away with anything he wants. But how are you going to make him talk to you? Not by flexing a military muscle. You've got other muscles that you'll have to flex, economic. And that is, but unfortunately, when you talk about economic muscles, immediately we get into the other prohibited word in international relations, sanctions. And just because you sanction a country, you're not going to force it into compliance. So we need leadership who look at the broader picture and not just sending the fleet into the oceans to take care of problem.
One last question. From your perspective, in what way uh, challenge being posed by China can be addressed, both by countries in the region, including India and others like the US?
You have to talk to them. You have to sit and talk to President Xi and find out and tell him, hey, this your approach would lead into a bigger disaster, which will be detriment for the growth of China also. It's not a one-way street. I think President Xi, understands that. He's not stupid. He's a brilliant statesman, but he's looking out for Chinese national interests, just like every other country is looking out for their own national interests. But somewhere down the line, you have to tell the Chinese leader, hey, this is disaster. You go in this is lead to another conflagration between the rest of the world and China, which is not in the best interest of the rest of the world or of China. Best way is to talk, to see what exactly we are sitting here and imagining what the Chinese want or what they are thinking. Better to find out from them what they are thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you.